Hello and welcome to this video about different styles of poetry. My name is Justin Rempel and I just want to give you a brief overview of some of the basic forms of poetry. This will give you a few different options that you can write in. Hopefully you can understand better what you're seeing when you look at poetry and just broaden your horizons a little bit. The first kind of poetry I want to talk about is acrostic poetry. And you've probably seen this before, even if you haven't heard the name. In acrostic poetry, the first letter of each line spells out a word. So if you take the time to look at the first letter in each line going down the list, it'll actually spell something out. And it should connect to the topic of the poem. So for example, here's a little poem I wrote about the heart. And you can see, if you take a look, I'll just circle it for you or point it out, at these first letters right here, that they actually spell out the word heart. The content of the poem is also talking about a heart. Here I am, essential symbol of love, at the center of it all, rocketing blood through your veins, throbbing, pulsing, pounding. Heart. A ballad is a narrative poem, which means it tells a story. Usually it's pretty long, and this is a folk style, a very traditional style of poetry that goes back a long, long time. Often it's made up of couplets, which are stanzas that are 2 lines long, or quatrains, which are 4-line stanzas. And often there's a refrain, like a repeating stanza or a chorus. A really good example is John Keats' La Belle Dame sans Merci. And here's just a little excerpt from that poem. I set her on my pacing steed, and nothing else saw all day long, for sidelong would she bend and sing a fairy's song. Blank verse. Remember, verse is just another word for poetry. Blank verse is poetry that has a meter, which is a specific rhythm, but it does not rhyme. That's why we call it blank, because there's no rhyme. The rhyme is missing. Usually blank verse is in iambic pentameter, which is 10-syllable lines of poetry. Good examples are John Milton, who writes in a lot of blank verse, especially his famous poem Paradise Lost, and a lot of Shakespeare is written in blank verse. All of Romeo and Juliet is iambic pentameter, and that's basically all unrhymed. It's basically all blank verse. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Has a specific meter, 10 syllables per line, not rhymed. Epic poetry is a long narrative or story poem. Epic means big, majestic, impressive. Epic poetry is usually about some kind of heroic quest or adventure. Good examples are Homer, which is ancient Greek poetry, his Odyssey or Iliad, or the Old English poem Beowulf. These are examples of epic poetry. It's a very classical form of poetry that was used a lot in ancient times. Free verse. This is a type of poetry that's used a lot in modern times. Remember, verse means poetry. Free verse does not have a rhyme. It does not have a meter or set rhythm or pattern. A really good example is Walt Whitman. Here's a little excerpt from Song of Myself. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul, I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. So Whitman is using all sorts of poetic devices, but he's not using rhyme, he's not using meter. Elegy. An elegy is a poem of mourning and tribute. So it's paying respect to someone or something after they've died, or after they've been lost, perhaps. Classic examples include John Milton's Lycidas or Sir Alfred Lord Tennyson's In Memoriam. Haiku is a traditional Japanese form of poetry, and it has very specific rules around it. It's always a tercet, 3 lines long, 1 stanza. The first line is 5 syllables, the second line is 7 syllables, and the third line is 5 syllables again. Usually it's about nature and the seasons, and this is a style of poetry that really values efficiency, saying something important in a short space. It's kind of like Twitter. You only have a certain amount of characters. It's really important that the haiku points to a deeper significance or truth, kind of like a proverb. It's designed to impart wisdom and make the reader think deeply. Here's a good example. The last autumn leaf has fallen and lies rotting in my neighbor's yard. Okay, so this is a very simple poetic scene from nature. It's connected to the seasons, and it might get you thinking about relationships, not between just people and nature, but also between neighbors. If you like haiku, there are many other styles of Japanese poetry that you can check out. A limerick. Limerick is usually a funny poem, although not always. It has a very bouncy, rollicking rhythm to it. It's always 5 lines long, and the rhyme scheme is A-A-B-B-A, where the A lines are long and the B lines are short. So it sounds something like this. A woman who once heard a mouse ran screaming all throughout her house. She sent in the cat to dispose of the rat, but found it was only her spouse. An ode. An ode is a poem of tribute, so it's kind of like an elegy, but whereas an elegy is really sad and in mourning, an ode is a poem of praise and honor. It's celebrating someone or something. It could be a person, but it could be something from nature, like a plant or an animal, maybe a beloved pet. It could even be an inanimate object like a book or a tower. Some good examples are John Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn and Percy Shelley's Ode to the West Wind. A prose poem. Now this is a bit of a confusing name, and it's a bit of a confusing form because whereas verse means poetry, prose is the opposite. Prose is writing that is not poetry. So what is a prose poem? It seems like a contradiction. It's a little bit tough to define, but a prose poem is a poem that looks like it's prose or vice versa. It might look more like a monologue or a paragraph from a book. What makes it poetry? It uses a lot of poetic devices and techniques, metaphor, simile, repetition, alliteration. It's not going to use rhyme. It's not going to use meter. So let's take a look at this example by David Ignato. It's called Information. Just listen to it. It sort of sounds like a paragraph from a book, but it's very poetic. This tree has 2,075,000 leaves. Perhaps I missed a leaf or two, but I do feel triumphant at having persisted in counting by hand, branch by branch, and marked down on paper with pencil each total. Adding them up was a pleasure I could understand. I did something on my own that was not dependent on others, and to count leaves is not less meaningful than to count the stars, as astronomers are always doing. They want the facts to be sure they have them all. It would help them to know whether the world is finite. I discovered one tree that is finite. I must try counting the hairs on my head. And you too. We could swap information. So you can hear it kind of sounds like a paragraph, but it kind of sounds like a poem. Shape poetry or concrete poetry is a fun one, and it really plays around with the layout of the words on a page. In shape poetry, the physical layout of the text or the words on the page makes a shape or a picture, and that shape or picture should have to do with the contents of the poem. So you can see some good examples here. There's a shape poem about a house, and it's in the shape of a house. There's a shape poem about a baby sister, and it's in the shape of a baby. A sonnet. This is a very classical form of poetry. It has quite a few rules. It's always a 14-line poem. It's usually an iambic pentameter. Often the theme is love, but not necessarily. And there's usually a distinctive moment of turning, which is called the volta. And it's a turn in theme or in sentiment. So you think the poem is heading in one direction, and then, oh, volta, it turns in another direction. There's two basic types of sonnets. There's the Italian sonnet, also called the Petrarchan sonnet, because Petrarch wrote a lot of these. And the rhyme scheme is ABBA, ABBA, CDE, CDE. So there's two quatrains and two tercets, and the volta is in between the quatrains and the tercets. There's also the English sonnet, or the Shakespearean sonnet, because Shakespeare wrote a lot of them. And the rhyme scheme goes ABBA, CDDC, EFFE, GG. There's three quatrains and then a couplet at the end, and the volta is right before that final couplet. So here's a good example, Sonnet 73 by William Shakespeare. That time of year thou mayst in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none, or few, do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bear ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self that seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire that on the ashes of his youth doth lie, as the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well, which thou must leave ere long. So you can hear from most of the poem, those first three quatrains, it's talking about growing old, and it sounds kind of sad and despairing. And then in the final couplet, it turns, there's a volta, it turns, and it talks about love in old age. A villanelle is a classic type of French poem. A lot of rules here too. It has a very specific structure. There's 5 tercets, those are 3-line stanzas, and 1 quatrain at the end. And the rhyme scheme is very tight. In fact, there's a lot of repeated lines. The first and third lines of the first stanza repeat, alternating in the following stanzas. So a really good example of this is Dylan Thomas, Do Not Go Gently Into That Good Night. But there's also this one here, The House on the Hill. They are all gone away. The house is shut and still. There is nothing more to say. Through broken walls and gray, the winds blow bleak and shrill. They are all gone away. Nor is there one today to speak them good or ill. There is nothing more to say. Why is it then we stray around the sunken sill? They are all gone away. And our poor fancy play for them is wasted skill. There is nothing more to say. There is ruin and decay in the house on the hill. They are all gone away. There is nothing more to say. So you can hear how the same lines repeat over and over throughout the poem. That's a villanelle.